it is my pleasure to introduce to you Debra Thompson. She is the Canada Research Chair in Racial Equality and Democratic Societies at McGill. Debra works on questions about the relationship between race, the state, and inequality. She's a political scientist, not a lawyer, and Deb kindly agreed to come and speak with us. I explained that we have lots of experts on law and doctrine, but that we think, some interventions and inputs from other places to help us set what we're focused on in a context, right? And various different contexts. So that's our kind of goal for our lunchtime keynotes. Deb's career as a professor has taken her from faculty positions at Ohio to Northwestern to Oregon before her return to Canada in 2020 to take up a position at McGill. Among the usual academic kind of work, articles and the like, Debra's the author of 2 books. Her first, The Schematic State, Race, Transnationalism, and the Politics of the Census. And her second, which some of you may have read, The Long Road Home on Blackness and Belonging. Both are multiple award winners. The Long Road Home brings scholarship and personal history together to wonderful effect. It is the 2022 Canadian Political Science Association Smiley Award winner for the best book on politics and government in Canada. And for those of you tired of the way that America so often figures in Canada's national myths, like as a shallow foil or a confusion about facts or a substitution of histories, this book's kind of searching attention to the connections and disconnections will really, I think, be welcome. Debra's scholarship represents something I've always admired and aspired to, which is scholarship that insists on following threads into spaces that are not always part of our usual disciplinary routes. So this insistence comes with a lively curiosity and engaged manner showcased in the book, which I heartily recommend, but also in her podcast that was produced for Policy Options, which takes on various aspects of inequality in Canadian society. I am particularly fond of episode 3, where Deb and Keith Banting chat about it, redistribution and inequality. So I can recommend that as well if you're looking for podcasts. In asking Debra to speak to us today, we're recognizing the connections and disconnections between political science as a discipline and the study and practice of constitutional law, the kind of many ways that we could shape those gaps in meanings and think about the gaps in meetings. Democracy is one particularly powerful idea that we all have to grapple with. And so I'm delighted to have Professor Thompson here to give the 2024 Laskin lecture on race, democracy, and politics without guarantees. Please help me welcome Deb.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia. Hi, everyone. This is literally the stuff of my anxiety dreams. I talk in front of crowds all the time, but they are very rarely crowds of lawyers. So this is literally my worst case scenario. And in part, it's the stuff of my anxiety dreams because I teach on the politics of race, and usually I have 15 weeks to make my case to students. And I have 45 minutes to make my case to you, and you don't know me and I don't know you, and I'm asking you for generosity and trust and benevolence. And so I hope that we can get there together. And it's important to preface my talk with that, because talking about racism is hard. It's really hard for a lot of people. It's particularly hard because, as my friend Charles Mills once wrote, the fish can't see the water, right? Like racism, structural racism, white supremacy, this is the water in which we're all swimming. But regardless, let's begin. So once upon a time, as the great political philosopher Taylor Swift once said a few mistakes ago, I was living in a land called Oregon. So if you've never been to Oregon, it's beautiful. It really is. It's breathtakingly beautiful. If you move across the state from the east to the west, it's like you're passing through environments that are separated by these invisible thresholds. And there are seething ideological tensions in the state that seem to mimic these discordant terrains. So it was back in January 2020, long before any of us had heard of anything called COVID. And like many Americans, I was appalled at the way the Trump administration seemed to stretch the norms of democratic rule. And like many Black Americans, I was very unsurprised by the emboldened white supremacy of Trump supporters. And at the time, I was sure that Trump was going to win a second term in office. So by that point, I had already decided to leave the University of Oregon to come back to Canada when someone from the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural Culture and History or something reached out, and they asked me if I wanted to take part in a fundraiser. So they had faculty from the university come and do a talk at a pub in Eugene, Oregon, where we were living. And would I be interested in presenting my research in this pub talk format? And I said, I have no research because I've had 2 children and 6 weeks of parental leave. But I'm moving back to Canada and I have a lot of feelings. Can I talk about that? And she said, yep, sure. Talk about whatever you want. This is very meta. So the title of my presentation was something like return some probably incoherent ideas about race, democracy, and going home again. And to my great surprise, the room was packed. Like I knew maybe a quarter of the people there, my friends, my colleagues, my students, and the rest were total strangers. And it was surprising in part because Americans do not care about Canada at all. But they were really interested in this story about what it was like to grow up Black in Canada, to be Black in the United States, what was familiar, what was different, what was inspiring, what was hopeless. And it occurred to me that maybe there might be something to this. And so that talk became this article that was published in the Globe and Mail on June 6, 2020, just as the kinetic uprising sparked by the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis spread like wildfire across the continent. And that article became the basis for this book. A lot of drafts later, because writing is messy and sometimes you learn as you write, and sometimes, like Neil Gaiman once wrote, the price of getting what you want is getting what once you wanted. And so that book, the article, and the talk all began with something my dad said in those early days of 2020. I was talking to him on the phone and I was like complaining about Trump or something. And he said to me, you know, Debra, your daughter is the first Thompson born in America since Cornelius Thompson escaped slavery. It's been over 150 years, and some days I think we came back too soon. And his words just stuck with me. I couldn't get them out of my head. So some backstory, my dad was born and spent a lot of his childhood in Shrewsbury, Ontario. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny town on the shores of Lake Erie, about 50 miles east of Detroit. It and other neighboring towns like Buxton and Dresden, these were the last stops on the Underground Railroad. So in 1850, the US Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act as part of a series of larger political compromises that were made between Southern enslaving states and the Northern free states. The act required officials arrest people who were suspected of being runaway slaves based on little or no evidence, and it penalized anyone who didn't comply. Anyone who was found aiding a runaway slave by providing food or shelter was liable to a $1,000 fine and 6 months in prison. Monetary awards were offered to anyone who captured a fugitive slave. And those who were suspected of being runaway slaves could not testify on their own behalf or defend themselves against the accusation. And so the result was a legalization of a national program of mass kidnapping of free Black people across the United States. But the Fugitive Slave Act did not extend to Canada. And so it was to Canada that thousands fled, including my grandfather's grandfather, Cornelius Thompson. So most of the people who escaped to Canada actually left to go back to the US at the end of the Civil War to find the loved ones that they left behind or who were stolen from them somewhere along the way, but generations of those who were descended from these Black American refugees from slavery still live in southwestern Ontario, including my dad's family. Because the communities are rural and segregated, my kin have the most wonderful way of speaking. My dad says theater, and he pronounces the WH in white. He talks in the same kind of riddles and metaphors that characterize barbershop talk in African-American culture. He says things like, you know, Debra, those politicians got nothing but a nodding acquaintance with the truth. But he's very Canadian, and his accent appears plainly in words like a boat and sorry. My dad doesn't know where Cornelius escaped from. He said he thought he heard someone talking about Alabama or Mississippi once, but he's skeptical. Debra, he says, you're looking for ghosts. You're looking for people. You're looking for evidence left behind by people who were trying to hide and whose lives depended on how well and how long they could do it. When I decided to move to the US more than a decade ago, I thought the ghosts of my ancestors would welcome me home. I felt like I was returning to the land of my ancestors' birth, the place where they prayed and sweated and toiled and were tortured and resisted and fought and wept as their children were stolen and sold and were traumatized as they were raped for profit and murdered for sport. The places that they died, the places they still haunt, they escaped, and I returned to lay claim to the humanity that they were refused. I felt like I was going home, and obviously I was wrong, but maybe not in the way that you might think. So what I want to share with you today are some of these invisible, even ghostly matters in a story of coming back both too soon and too late, and the ways that moments and places actually help create and sustain our identities. I want to tell you some of the story of what it was like to be in the US, in the land of my ancestors, in a country that both was and was not mine, to be doubly unwanted as both an immigrant and a Black person, but there by choice and protected by incredible class privilege. And then to leave to come back here to a country of my birth, the country I also love, even though I think all forms of nationalism are highly problematic. I want to acknowledge the unrepentant structural racism of American society while not negating the hidden subversive racism here in Canada, and to relay my bewilderment and my awe at Black people's love and hope for both America and Canada, their pride in their countries, even as they have more often than not refused to love us back. I'm also trying to think through the here and now, nearly 4 years removed from those kinetic uprisings in the summer of 2020. The moment that we're in now is much less clearly defined, much more indeterminate. It's a moment when old horizons have collapsed and new ones have not yet taken shape. We're in a time now, I think, of speculation and flux, vulnerability and risk, and therefore incoherence, but also possibility. It is, as the cultural theorist Stuart Hall once wrote, a politics without guarantees. The Overton window is still open. We still have potential to create the kind of radical change that could make our democracy more egalitarian for more people. But the politics of guarantees works both ways. So take heed, we might not like what emerges on the other side of this moment. Racial progress has always been shadowed by disproportionate backlash. And this most recent iteration of backlash is embedded alongside other populist authoritarian forces that can lead to democratic backsliding, the erosion of minority rights, and the consolidation of legal, economic, and political inequality for a generation. We need to decide what kind of democracy we want, both in this country and in the United States, and what kind of future we want to build. So let's begin. America, are there any Americans here? So Americans often think about their country as being exceptional. It is one of the world's oldest democracy, the birthplace of revolutionary freedom, the only remaining superpower, the last line of defense in a world constantly threatened by demagogues and dictators. Most famously articulated by the French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville in his 1835 volume, Democracy in America, the concept of American exceptionalism suggests that the tenacity of American democratic ideals is unusual, beautiful, extraordinary, or unparalleled. There's something dramatic, or maybe it's just dramatically individualistic about the primacy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It always seemed so much more daring than Canada's motto of peace, order, and good governance. But the doctrine of American exceptionalism requires a willful ignorance about how democracy worked for those people who were excluded from that 18th century formulation of we the people. The self-evident truth of the liberal ideal that we are all created equal was scarred into the Declaration of Independence at the same time that nearly 20% of the population was held in bondage. So from the vantage point of African Americans, the United States isn't actually exceptionally free or exceptionally equal. In fact, American racism is all the more ruinous, tragic, and cunning precisely because it exists alongside, but in direct contradiction with the American dream, the American creed, and the homogenizing power of American national identity. And to those of us who observe American history in the making from abroad, the United States is exceptional only in terms of how utterly, unforgivingly, uncompromisingly racist it is. Now, the idea of American racial exceptionalism is actually quite powerful here in Canada. We understand American racism as morally real as real and morally repulsive. And so in comparative terms, we assume that Canadian racism either does not exist, or if it does exist, it is somehow less harmful, less entrenched, and less depraved than the racism that exists in the United States. I think there's a few reasons why Canadians think this way, but the most relevant is the way that America and its foundational ideas, narratives, obsessions, psychoses, and identities have influenced the formation of our national identity here in Canada. Throughout our history, we, at least in Anglophone Canada, have struggled to formulate our own national identity. It's hard to share a border, language, culture, and the media with the world's only superpower. And so for Canadians, the US is kind of like Regina George. We hate her, but we love her. And she's terrible, but sometimes she's like not terrible to us, but she's frequently terrible to other people. But really, why won't she pay attention to us? It hurts our feelings that she doesn't think we're cool. And so because there are actually a lot of cultural similarities between Canada and the US, being Canadian is defined at least in part by being not American. And this has ramifications for how we understand ourselves in racial terms. The logic is something like this. Racism exists in America. Canada is not America. Ergo, there is no racism in Canada. Comparison is frequently, faithfully used in the service of Canadian deniability. That's our national pastime. It's an obsession that works to simultaneously hide and entrench the persistent racial inequalities that characterize nearly every socioeconomic indicator we have. But more on that in a second. There's another side to this. When I was once doing a presentation like this in Canada at a university that I won't name, but it was Queen's. After I finished, an older couple came up to me and said, "Don't worry, we didn't think you were Black until you mentioned it." And they meant it as a compliment. And it was so Canadian of them. There is, I think, an innate value in exploring Blackness, race, democracy, belonging between Canada and the US, not necessarily in comparison to one another, but rather in relation. Ideas and inspirations, people and profits, goods and grievances have crossed the border for centuries. Black freedom dreams as well have never been bound by national borders. And so while other people compare racism in the US to more overt circumstances of racial apartheid like existed in South Africa or Nazi Germany, the insistence in Canada that racism happened somewhere else, or maybe happened here, but a long time ago, requires a kind of national ignorance that itself is worthy of careful examination. Extreme cases have a lot to tell us, but so do unsuspecting ones. And so Canadian peculiarities make for really interesting politics. Black communities in Canada are both very old, predating Confederation by over 100 years, and very new, growing exponentially only in the mid to late 1990s. The population is small at just 4-ish% of the national population, but significant in cities like Toronto, Halifax, Montreal, Ottawa. We are the diaspora of the diaspora, so to speak. Both old and new Black communities are products of global collusions and imperial collisions of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. But we Black Canadians do not have the same level of political or cultural recognition as African Americans, nor do we have the sheer magnitude of the millions that comprise the Black descended population in the Caribbean or South America. Blackness in Canada also exists within the crucible of Canadian exceptionalism. That is Canada, the exceptional, Canada, the clearly not racist, Canada, the good, Canada, the white savior, Canada, the successful multicultural experiment. The dismissiveness of the realities of racism is actually part of the appeal, because if Canada is the exception to global racial rule, then we have no need to examine our exceptionally Canadian racial rules. It's a distraction, of course, because Canadian racism is not just shaped by a global history that gives it a familiar force and feeling, but also by those specificities that make it Canadian born and bred, just like me. And so it's an open empirical question about how Canadian racism is shaped by Canadian democracy, Canadian political structures, Canadian liberalism, Canadian whiteness, Canadian politeness, Canadian public policy, Canadian political culture, Canadian political parties, Canadian popular culture, Canadian urban centers, Canadian regionalism, Canadian ruralism, Canadian media, Canadian peacekeeping, Canadian war making, Canadian bilingualism, Canadian settler colonialism, and the Canadian national inferiority complex. Moreover, racism in Canada doesn't manifest in the same way as it does in the United States. We often think about people as being racist or behaving in racist ways, but racism isn't just a function of individual attitudes, and so we can't eradicate it by changing hearts and minds. Racism is a social, legal, political, and economic distinctions that mark and maintain unequal entry and access points to privacy, property, protection, prosperity, and personhood. Racism is systemic, which means it is embedded deeply in our institutions, in our legal system, in our public policies, in our social norms, and our ideas about who deserves what. Racism has shaped the contours of every single major social, legal, and economic institution in the United States. Every single one. If you name me an institution, I can tell you its racist history, from banking and real estate to the location of highways and grocery stores, from the funding of K-12 education, the origins of the Second Amendment, and the lack of anything that comes close to universal health care. Racism has shaped every facet of American society in ways that I didn't realize until I got there. But racism in Canada is even more malleable, even harder to pin down. It is purposeful exclusion and predatory inclusion. It is invisibility and hypervisibility. It is operationalized by the differential effects of universalistic laws and policies, the informalities and discretion built into systems of power, hidden entry points, overly emphasized exit ramps, and normalized patterns of behavior that are excused away because this is just the way we've always done things here at McGill, Debra. Canadian racism is state action that deliberately limits movement, the accumulation of wealth, or access to opportunities. And it is also when governments choose not to act and instead let racist systems remain undisturbed. It is selective interest, sustained indifference, and messages of personal choice that naturalize racial inequality as a consequence only of individual failings. It is government protection and benefits that are hard to access or withdrawn without notice. And it is the co-optation of radical demands in order to make them more palatable, marketable, and profitable. We have, in fact, ample evidence of the persistent socioeconomic disparities that plague Black communities in Canada, even long-standing ones. According to a series of reports published by StatsCan, between 2001 and 2016, unemployment rates among the Black population were higher than the rest of the population, even at higher levels of education. Poverty rates were also higher, and the wage gap between Black people and white groups are persistent and significant. Black Canadians are twice as likely as non-Black counterparts to experience discrimination in the workplace. And according to the Black Experience Project, 2/3 of respondents report that they frequently or occasionally experience anti-Black racism, and 8 in 10 report daily microaggressions. Even second-generation Canadians, so those people who were born and bred in this country, report lower levels of feeling as if they truly belong, and they are economically disadvantaged, even when we control for levels of education. More troubling still is the way that Black people most frequently experience democracy through our interactions with the coercive and punitive arms of the state. Numerous recent reports detail that Black people face rampant systemic racism in urban centers, are disproportionately stopped, carded, charged, arrested, and subjected to the use of force by law enforcement, and are overrepresented in the system of mass incarceration. In fact, as Akwasi Owusu-Bempah demonstrates, if you look at the rates of incarceration compared to population size, Black people are actually over-incarcerated more in Canada than in the US, even as the discourse of the new Jim Crow has conceptualized that as a uniquely American phenomenon. So here's the rub. Canadian exceptionalism does a lot of conceptual work for us. Maybe it's precisely because we think Canada is a more egalitarian society that we believe even more deeply that we have created a true meritocracy where hard work is rewarded and more frequently and objectively than nepotism. Maybe it's because you think you are here because of your sheer brilliance and not because of the dynastic quality of legal professions in Canada, or because the single largest determinant of educational attainment is your parents' level of income. Maybe it is this deeply held belief about how diverse and multicultural and fair and ethical and fundamentally good we are that makes it harder for us to see the ways that our society is in fact acutely unequal. And maybe it is that complacency that led us to this moment. I moved back to Canada in the summer of 2020. It was a very specific moment. Some people called it a racial reckoning, hearkened by death, substantiated through struggle, haunted by the conceptual space between what was imaginable, and later what was revealed as possible. We didn't know at the time what had come crashing into the public sphere, full of fury and passion and chaos, and sadly, but predictably, later, dilution and co-optation. Even now, 4 years later, there isn't a coherent narrative that can explain why it is the world stopped to protest, to grieve, to rage, to rebel, to mourn together. I don't think reckoning is the right word for all that's happened between then and now. The idea of a reckoning is about honored promises, debts repaid, and a balance restored. To reckon can also be used as a verb to express dreams or expectations, just as readily as a reckoning also faces the past again and again, like the way a return involves coming back to the beginning of a journey. But let's think back to that moment in the summer of 2020 when things seemed so much clearer to so many of us. According to the Crowd Counting Consortium, the protests that followed George Floyd's murder were some of the biggest, longest lasting, and most diverse we've ever seen in this country or on this continent. Somewhere between 15 and 26 million people participated in the protests in the United States. Estimates were around 80,000 people in Philadelphia and around 5,000 distinct protests in between May and July 2020. In Canada and the US, many of the places where people protested were predominantly white. Most protesters were under 35. Most earned over $150,000 a year. And there were protests on literally every continent, including a Black Lives Matter flag on the science station in Antarctica. We also saw a massive shift in public opinion. So why didn't we see this kind of support after Michael Brown was killed, or Eric Gardner, or Rekia Boyd, or Freddie Gray, or John Crawford, or Laquan McDonald, or Alton Sterling, or Tamir Rice, or any of the others? Why was this event of recursive trauma such a catalyst? I think it's a combination of a few factors. So one, there was the video that was taken by a teenager who still has nightmares to this day and went viral. There was the established infrastructure of Black Lives Matter. In fact, we talk about 2020 as the third phase of Black Lives Matter. There was a specific context of Minneapolis where the protests began, which has a very long and really interesting history of anti-fascist organizing. And there was, of course, the police response to the initial protests in Minneapolis. So research in the social sciences demonstrates that the police actually tend to be more violent, ironically, during protests against police violence. And this time, the escalations were happening to white journalists. And of course, this was all being live streamed on Twitter, rest in peace, when it still existed. But let me single out two of the drivers that I actually think are the most consequential. First, COVID. At the beginning of the pandemic, it became clear that high-risk, essential work was being done mostly by racialized people who were dying at much higher rates than other groups. Some have argued that we saw mass mobilization just because white people were bored and sheltering in place. I think that a more generous interpretation is that COVID was an unprecedented disruption in people's lives, and many people had to come to terms, perhaps for the first time, with precarity, and that made them more empathetic to Black people who had been living in a police state. The second important driver, Trump, just period. If you recall, during the era of Trump, there were a lot of protests under a lot of different topics that seemed like they were about things like the Women's March and the March for Science and the March for Our Lives, but they were really anti-Trump protests. The protests, I think, were also probably galvanized by some disappointment in the Democrats. After the most interesting slate of candidates during the Democratic primaries in 2020, we ended up with Joe Biden. We could have had President Elizabeth Warren. But there were also protests about a massive failure on the part of the government in those early months of COVID. It was an epic policy failure that resulted in thousands of deaths. We always knew that Trump was bad, but this was a new necropolitics of life and death that revealed that he was worse than maybe we even imagined. And there were some people who were willing to draw those connections between Trump and COVID and the police and necropolitics. The state had the chance to do something to protect life, and it failed. And when Derek Chauvin kneeled on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, it seemed to confirm that the police, as armed agents of the state, not only were incapable of protecting life, but they were very comfortable in dealing out death. And we were reminded, perhaps, of that classic Weberian definition of the state. The state is, remember from your poli-sci classes, an entity that maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in a given territory. At the core of state power is violence, and this, to many of us, seemed wrong. When so many of us took to the streets in the summer of 2020, it seemed like a seismic disruption, with the potential to catalyze an acknowledgement that white supremacy was born and bred in the global sphere, an understanding that racism can manifest in the realm of ideas and spread across borders as easily as the wind, an appreciation that historical context and local circumstances matter, but they are nevertheless inflected with lessons and lesions from abroad, a resurrection of the disruptive, fracturing, compounding potential of diasporic and cross-racial solidarity. Some people called it the third Reconstruction. And so, as with the first Reconstruction after the end of the Civil War, and the second Reconstruction after the long civil rights movement, the attempt to expand democratic boundaries in the third Reconstruction followed an established pattern. First, Black mobilization. Social movements are a crucial part of democracy. They're like a fifth estate that can challenge the dominant social political order. Social movements also make us believe that governments can, in fact, be responsive to we, the people, and ordinary citizens can create meaningful political change. Power lies with the people, but that means all people. Because if we really believe in liberal democracy, if we really believe in the equal moral worth of every human being, that means that democracy has to include those people who occupy the lower frequency of our social, political, economic order. That includes poor people, exploited people, incarcerated people, homeless people, precariously positioned people, and people who do not believe in this democracy. Democracy has to include them all. Second, interest convergence. So those who know your critical race theory know that Derek Bell, who was once the dean of the law school at the University of Oregon, where I used to work before moving on to Harvard, we consider him the father of critical race theory. The basic argument he made a long time ago was that minority groups see advancements and social change when their interests align with that of majorities. Now, these are important insights. It means that we need white allies, and that getting white allies to fight against their investment in a social, political, economic order that benefits them is going to be challenging. Bell also theorized that interest convergence is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, cross-racial coalitions can form and can successfully move towards racial justice. On the other hand, these achievements only last as long as white people feel that they are in their interests. And that means that white support is sometimes, as demonstrated by public support for Black Lives Matter, temporary. Third, movement fracture and movement capture. Now, there's always been significant external challenges to Black Lives Matter. And in 2020, we began to see some of the significant internal challenges to Black Lives Matter. One of them was the issue of reform versus revolution. To put it crudely, body cams versus police defunding, and different visions with what it means to work with the political establishment, or if we should at all. There were also problems about how a locally based social movement purports to be accountable to its constituents and who those constituents are. And finally, the very real danger of what Megan Ming Francis calls movement capture, that is philanthropic organizations that seek to fund the movement and offer money, but with strings attached. Often, funding comes with the intent to redirect or reshape insurgency towards more centrist goals, or ties money to activists' ability to get results, which compels organizers to actually compete against each other rather than cooperate. And finally, the last stage, backlash. Now, in the first and second Reconstruction, it was very clear that opponents of the movement used the power of the state and sometimes extra legal forces like the KKK to recreate, reify the status quo. So Reconstruction was followed by redemption. The civil rights movement brought us Nixon's law and order discourses, and then the war on drugs with Reagan. And after the longest lasting protest we've ever seen, we're very clearly in the moment of backlash now. Here in Canada, the backlash manifests as attacks on diversity initiatives, death threats sent to Black Canadian journalists, the use of woke as a disparaging slur, the insistence that white professors and teachers can use the N-word in their classrooms because of academic freedom. It is the dilution that turned radical demands that we rethink what we mean by justice to little more than EDI trainings. It is as much the benign neglect of the state as it is the collective shrug of Canadians everywhere about the predetermined failure of so many of the initiatives that we had hoped would change our workplaces, our education system, our social moorings, and our access to substantive democratic belonging. And maybe the backlash seems muted, or maybe not as concerning here in Canada because we have a long tradition of denial through comparison. Maybe it's because, as research by political scientists like Chris Cochran and Eric Merkley demonstrate, partisan sorting and effective polarization are in fact not as prevalent in Canada as they are in the US. Maybe it's because we're used to these big debates about our national identity happening in mega constitutional forums. Constitutional creation, charter tests. You lawyers love your charter tests. Referenda and reference cases, the accords in Charlottetown and Meech Lake, declarations, apologies, national inquiries, royal commissions, task forces. This is where we decide who we are as Canadians. And so once again, we need to take heed. While we watch the pending electoral spectacle in the US and here, both the venues for these debates and the terms of the debates are shifting beneath our feet. The new battlegrounds are not mega constitutional forums. They are our schools, our libraries, school board elections, university campuses, community groups, social networks, municipal elections, provincial politics, and of course, social media. And I think this means three things. One, it is in fact hard to draw any definitive conclusions about what's going on in the country because these networks are defined by local peculiarities. Two, the eruptions of race-based hate or claims that the wokes have gone too far, or anti-trans legislation, or scapegoating international students for the housing crisis. They all might seem unconnected, but they're actually ideologically coherent and at times politically coordinated arguments that are orchestrated and funded by various right-wing philanthropists, private sector, and civil society organizations. And third, we are not paying nearly enough attention to what is happening on the ground, and that is because we have gutted local journalism. What's happening on the ground matters because that's where democracy happens. What if democracy isn't in fact elections or even the charter? You know, I love the charter. What if democracy is actually about democratic experience? When we interact with the state, what does that do to our feelings of democratic belonging? When we interact with agents of the state, especially those agents that operate through surveillance and punishment and control, and yeah, the police, but also welfare, foster care, healthcare, schools. What does that make us think about the democratic promise? The quotidian matters, but what is clear is that nothing would have happened had Black people and our allies not taken to the streets. As the great orator and abolitionist Frederick Douglass once said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And so at what is the beginning, not the middle, and not the end of this most recent iteration of backlash, the very least we can do, I think, is remember and try to make sense of all that was and all that still could be in a politics without guarantees. Thank you.
It's hard to say inspiring after kind of the last piece of that, but thank you so much to Debra for kind of bringing us a particular set of thoughts about the context in which we are doing our work, whatever that work may be as lawyers and legal academics. Does anyone have a question that they would like to pose to Debra? Right after this, as you know, we'll have another, our final panel of the day. Do I have that right? 2 more panels. Sorry, guys, I'm ahead of myself. But we have some time for questions if people have them.
Hi, Debra. That was amazing, really. To quote the same famous philosopher, Taylor Swift, some things do die by a death by 1,000 cuts. And when you mentioned the kind of slow decline of that kinetic energy that kind of accumulated in December 2020, you mentioned that there is a tendency to hyper-focus on one cause and then kind of maybe ignore the others. And Oregon is a fascinating place for this because the death by 1,000 cuts was all of the white majority in Oregon slowly but surely silencing the voices of Black Americans in that state to try and use that kinetic energy for their own policy purposes. And Oregon's governor and everyone else started to focus more on their demands than the demands of the few Black Americans that are in Oregon. There's a famous Economist piece actually on Oregon's dark, deeply racist history for a state that's been voting blue for as long as it has and champions itself as the most racially progressive state in America. And I guess my question is with respect to how this kind of displacement of focus happens in the law. And I've been grappling with this for a while. I've termed it, using judicial square pegs for legislative round holes, specifically with respect to the Dobbs decision, which has to do with women's rights, but also with Black women's rights, which is the tendency in Canada and the US to try and litigate our way out of issues that should have been, should be, will be legislatively resolved, because that type of top-down approach to solutions tends to either in the process get diluted, and diluted is the word used, or has to be framed in the language of the law as opposed to the language of the people who are demanding their rights. So just because you're a political science professor, I'm more interested from your perspective of that non-legal approach to civil rights activism as opposed to how a lawyer might approach it.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there is, so within critical race theory, and certainly within, if I can use lessons here from Indigenous folks, there's a huge divide about the power of the law to affect social change, really. And I think that what I'm not necessarily an expert on Black Lives Matter, the movement, but I certainly understand Black Lives Matter, the ideology. The what Black Lives Matter came down on, at least in the US, was that like, we need a full attack on all aspects. And that means using the law imperfectly, as imperfect as it is. That means using mass mobilization. That means like Black Lives Matter. One of the successes of the movement has been to replace attorneys generals in the US and to really fight those local battles on that front. And the hope is that if you can get folks in positions of power who are more empathetic to the kinds of reforms that Black Lives Matter activists and others are fighting for, then maybe there will be a sea change, a tide change. But there are other folks who are very, very critical of the use of the law, and the limits of the law in fighting for anything that looks like racial justice. I mean, I did a presentation to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada a few months ago. And I was talking about defunding the police, just like in an academic way. And my goodness, they got so mad. They were very, 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 very unhappy at the idea of defunding the police, even as like, look, it is worth considering. It is worth thinking about as a policy proposal. It's worth weighing whether or not that as a policy proposal could achieve policy goals better than what we have now, which is, if I can like put on my defund hat for a second, something happens to you, you got one number to call. That's it. You got a problem with your neighbor, your son won't move out of the house, you're assaulted, you have one, there's someone on the subway in a mental health crisis, you got one number and a person with a gun is going to show up. That seems wacky. And this is what I think a lot of activists would say. Anyway, to a very roundabout way of answering your question is like, this is a very, very real divide in the movement. And there's no consensus except that because white supremacy, they would argue, is everywhere. We need people everywhere. We need lawyers. We need judges. We need CEOs. We need people in all parts of society to help combat these conditions. I don't know how to work.
I'm gonna put a question that I don't know. I think that given some of the things we've talked about at this conference, others might want to hear you on. And it's basically about the connection and disconnection between Black Lives Matter and Idle No More as protests in Canada. Yeah. And then I'm just sorry, chair's privilege here, but I wondered if maybe we could hear you on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are folks who have written on those deep connections. Certainly, Robin Maynard and Leanne Simpson, their great book Rehearsals for Living. I think that you don't see the mobilization of Black Lives Matter in Canada without the groundwork that was set by Idle No More, for sure. I think that opens really interesting questions about the possibilities and potentials of solidarity, but with nuance, with caveats, right? Like the important point here is like solidarity is forged, right? Solidarity is work, right? So the ways in which I think Indigenous folks who are mobilizing and Black folks who are fighting against anti-Black racism need to come to terms with the ways that Black people uphold settler colonialism and Indigenous nations are sometimes racist towards Black people, right? Like, I think that as a very, as a diverse country, like I talked a lot about like whiteness, and it's just so it's clear. Again, I usually have 15 weeks with my students. Like whiteness doesn't mean white people. Whiteness is a power relation, right? Whiteness is a concept. And so we need to think about these nuances and contradictions within all of our groups, you know, and that includes in the Black community. So solidarity is super tough. It needs to be forged, and as you know, within the Black community, we generally like to talk about Black folks as arrivants rather than settlers, because like we didn't come here by choice. So I don't know what that does in terms of our complicity in terms of the violence of the ongoing violence of settler colonialism. But you know, there are certainly intersections and interests that can be aligned. It's hard work.
So unless there's another question in the room, I've got the online one. Yeah. So I'm going to ask this one. So I think I'm going to paraphrase it. So you put COVID in as a really important moment of precarity and recognition of precarity. So this question is, can social justice discourse and praxis exist meaningfully within a socio-political context that continues to pretend that COVID is basically over? And I suppose you could take that in a lot of different directions, but kind of, did that also end?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I think that COVID, in particular, the mass mobilizations that we saw, you saw that the peak in support for Black Lives Matter, and then it dropping off by September. And in fact, support for Black Lives Matter now, according to public opinion polls in the US, is lower than where it was when George Floyd was murdered. And so that initial peak was really because of the focusing event that COVID offered. Focusing events, a theory in public policy that talks about the way that, you know, these sudden dynamic events can open up a window of opportunity for change. And so in terms of that window of opportunity, while a policy window might still be open and requires kind of policy entrepreneurs who are invested and who want to push forward changes, that's still open. The mass mobilization, I think, is long gone, and the long lasting effects, because like, you know, I think the public now, even as COVID is still very clearly with us, we are now used to it, and it doesn't have that shock value in the way focusing events need to be shocking in order to galvanize change. And I don't see COVID doing that because it's become normalized, right? Like, and whenever things become normalized and mainstream, it is much, much, much harder to affect change.
So with that, I think I'm going to ask us to thank Debra again for her incredible talk.
Thank you.